Roles of modern trends versus evergreen principles in a game success. We have Arjun Balaram from EA. We have Keerti Singh from Hitwicket. We have Joseph Kim from Lila Games. And it will be moderated by James Batchelor. Give me 2 minutes. We'll just set up the chair.
Morning. How you doing? Hello. Oh, yes, that's on. Sorry. Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is James Batchelor. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Gamesindustry.Biz. We're the leading B2B publication for the video games industry. And as said, we are talking about the roles of modern trends versus evergreen principles in a video game success. I am joined by half a panel with the other half on the way. I think we're basically going to expand as we go. We're like a live service panel. It's just going to expand as it goes along. For now, I'm going to introduce the panelists who have to, or rather, I'm going to ask the panelists who have turned up to introduce themselves. So, Arjun, could you give us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm in charge of early retention, so that when the other panelists come along, like you guys are sticking around still. So I work with Electronic Arts. I've done a lot of work in mobile live services. Currently, I'm with the Sims franchise, transitioning the Sims 4, which is an HD experience, into a live service as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Keerti, co-founder at Hitwicket. Hitwicket is a mobile cricket game with over 12 million users across the globe and the highest rated mobile game on Play Store and App Store. And I handle product and data at Hitwicket.
I'm going to start with quite a broad question. Like inevitably, this discussion is going to get into like the modern trends and stuff. But before we dive into that, I want to talk about the Evergreen principles. What factors are there that like still play or always have played into a game's success? Like regardless of how much the industry has changed, what does a game's success depend on?
I think few core fundamentals that remain constant throughout is one, player is the central piece, and by player I mean the user. A lot of time when we are looking at the product and game, we are biased towards what we think would be engaging, but at the end of the day, it's the masses that will determine the success of the game. So keeping users central to what we are building for always remains a very strong pillar for the game success. Second, I would say, would be on the monetization front, where everything is captured right from the start of the game, and it is not something that is built later on. So the moment you're thinking about the game, that how it is going to engage my players to a much deeper level, will it actually get them to spend? If those core principles are thought through from the start, then you know that you're not thinking about this big problem later down the road, but from the start of it. So these are two main things that come to my mind.
Sure, I can add on to that. I think one key thing is, even you mentioned the number of players that you have, millions of players. So one key thing I think is being able to have organic installs. So if you have, ideally, if you're able to associate yourself with a known IP, that gives you a leg up because then there's already awareness and players will at least download your game and have a look at it. I think that is important. And then once they have a look at it, minimizing. So it's interesting. At EA, we talk a lot about the player experience and the fun, finding the fun in the game. I think equally important is minimizing player friction. And so it's super important that you're able to minimize the points where the player is getting pissed off with their experience in the game. So yeah.
How would you say these things have changed over the years? So like, I think you're right, like players have always been centered to a game's success, like actually appealing to players. Obviously, over the years, the decades, interacting with players has become a lot more easier for companies. You've got social media, you've got focus group, you've got ways to directly interact with players. So how has that kind of changed the approach to working with players to make a game successful and catering to what they want?
So I think when we're talking about players also, there's a very wide spread of players that play the game. And dissecting that player audience to understand that, which are the users who are going to spend maybe 10, 15 minutes in the game. They're just looking for a casual, quick break. Whereas what are the kind of users who will actually spend hours on the game? Which are the users who are ready to become the super fans of the game and, will contribute to the community aspect? So understanding that, which type of users are going to fall in which category and ensuring that, there's a very active touch point with the players. Because if you take the feedback of somebody who's playing the game for 10 minutes and try to build a very deep mechanic which is going to engage the users who are already spending 1 hour, then it's a mismatch. So there I would say that, dissecting your player base, understanding that which feedback is coming from what user persona, and making sure that you have a community, multiple touch points of interacting with your players.
Yeah, the out-of-game experience is pretty important nowadays. Like I was talking to somebody and they said they're into streaming. Players nowadays have a very small attention span and are typically on 3 screens at the same time, right? And so whatever you can do to engage with them on those multiple screens, whether they are playing your game or not, but at least having some way to engage, either with their friends or with stuff that is going to come up in your game and so on, I think that is important.
Let's get into the newer stuff then. From your perspective, like kind of what are the the modern trends, like the newer factors that play into a game's success that weren't true, say, 5-10 years ago?
I can start. So I think one trend that has been prevalent in the last 5 years or so is mixing of genres, like Gardenscapes, and there's so many examples of that where you have match-3 games with narrative and quests, and there's sometimes even 3 genres that are blended in. And that is interesting because then you're catering to multiple player motivations. And so one can be a relaxing experience while it's in pursuit of another motivation that they have. I think that's a big trend, and a lot of games are seeing success with that.
Does that become more difficult then if you're catering to multiple player motivations, as you say, and you're kind of catering to different audiences? Like when you're expanding a game, when you're growing a game, you've got to cater for different tastes, different preferences. You don't want to kind of alienate the people who are playing it for the narrative. You don't want to alienate them by not adding more story, but then the people who are just playing to relax, you don't want to alienate them by bombarding them with story.
I would say the acceptability of games has increased a lot. And what has happened is that because there are a lot of games out there, people also tend to try out those games. Now, you may not be, let's say, a simulation fan, but if you stumble upon some game which has mixed simulation with some other mechanic, you actually end up getting exposed to the other genre. And that kind of, has built awareness. I actually think that, it's a great point that earlier people would think that I'll play a certain game, but now, there's so much of overlap between the kind of games people are playing. Somebody who's playing a shooter game is also playing a dice game or Candy Crush. And that's, I think, has really evolved. The audience has evolved, and people are not associating themselves with genres, but the fact that is the game engaging and fun.
I'm going to go slightly on a tangent. Like, are there any things that you in particular, like as an individual, as a player, etc., that you'd like to see? You're starting to see emerge in the industry, and you want to see more of going forward in terms of like what games are doing to engage players. Like, is there something that you would like to see happen more often and see develop?
Could you elaborate a little bit?
I guess I'm thinking of we've been talking about the way that the games are handled, like things like Gardenscapes is doing different genres within one. I'm just thinking, like, you as individuals, like, is there something that you have enjoyed in a game or have seen in other titles and thought that's brilliant? I'd like to see more of this going forward. I'd like to see the industry take this idea, take this trend, and develop it. We'll pass that to the latecomer.
Sorry, what was the question?
Well, the first question is, who are you?
Hi, I'm Joseph Kim. I work at a company called Lila Games. We're based in Bangalore, working on 2 games. Our main game is a mobile extraction shooter and for the global market, and we're also working on a dating simulation game for India.
So we've been talking about the kind of the modern trends in game development and player retention and so forth, and what new things companies are doing to kind of keep players engaged. I was asking them, the panel, like, what they as individuals have seen in the industry and would like to see more of, what they'd like to see the industry, like developers, building on and expanding to kind of improve what games offer.
Well, I think the one thing that we're starting to see is kind of a return to kind of what I call a 3 pillars model. Basically, this notion that, at least in the mobile space, and I can't speak too much for the PC console space, but in the mobile space, this notion of having a high quality game, great live ops, and then growth. And I think that's the one thing in terms of the growth area is where we've seen since IDFA deprecation a bigger focus. And so what we've seen companies that have been tying more of the product to user acquisition and how well user acquisition can do against a specific type of game. And we've seen pretty big successes recently when you look at games like Whiteout Survival, for example, where it used to be that you had misleading ads, and those ads would act as a funnel to bring you to a game. And now what we've seen is we've seen a hybridization occurring where you're taking like a hyper casual or more casual gameplay for, on the back end, what would be a higher monetizing game like a 4X game, but you're actually integrating within the same game different kinds of gameplay mechanics and different kinds of gameplay, because we know that if we can get a high top of funnel and bring a lot of players into the game and then convert them to the higher monetizing game, that is a winning business model. And so I think in terms of what I'm seeing in terms of trends is that model where we're seeing growth becoming an increasingly important factor for mobile games, and then how do you integrate that directly into the product is something that's been probably, I would say, one of the biggest trends of the last year or two.
I actually had a question on quality.
Yes.
I think that's an interesting term because in general, aiming for higher quality means higher production budgets.
I would say, like, I mean, one thing as far as mobile is concerned is that I don't think it's necessarily about the production budget, but I would say quality as a catch-all term that would describe the quality of the player experience, right? And not only from the perspective of like, you know, how snappy the gameplay is, you know, how fast load times are, match times, the quality of the art, but just how well that the specific gameplay in the game resonate with an audience, and that is also differentiated from other products in market. Because I do think that one of the things that we've also been seeing is too many Me Too products, right? And so trying to compete now with the Me Too product with slightly higher production value doesn't seem to be the winning formula.
Well, I was going to ask about that as well, because you say about all the Me Too products. Like mobile in particular is so crowded now that simply having a good game in terms, a good quality game, whether that's in terms of production values or just in how well it engages the player, having a quality game doesn't seem to be enough anymore. We've seen in various aspects, mobile, console, PC over the last few years. So we've seen games that have come out and everyone who's played them, critics and players, have agreed these are of a high quality, but they still haven't got the audience, the traction, the enough. So when quality isn't enough, when good quality is not enough to guarantee your game's success, what can you do to improve your chances?
Right, and I think that's also an interesting question. When we think again about the three-pillar model, like one of the other interesting things that's happened recently is when we look at the performance of Brawl Stars. And so what we saw over the past couple of years, the last few years, is that Brawl Stars is an old game. It was in decline. But last year, the Supercell team that worked on Brawl Stars dramatically increased the revenue of that game through live ops. And so the quality of the game in terms of like the orientation around gameplay is an issue, but especially when we're talking about free-to-play products and products that have a very long lifetime, then I do think that, we used to think that live ops is something that you just kind of do, and then you just try to, mitigate the effects of a declining game over time. But what we've seen recently are examples such as with Brawl Stars, where with the right team and with the right live ops cadence, the right kinds of events, the right kinds of sales, the right kinds of things to keep an audience engaged over time, that you can dramatically increase the performance of these games.
Also, I think quality is not like a one-stop destination. It's like an endless journey because, you can start with something which may not look visually very appealing, but could be actually a lot more fun. And then, you go on in that journey. So I think more, like quality could have a different perception, what quality is capturing. But I think at the end of the day, the user centricity is the most important. And you got to make sure that, you're constantly evolving the product. You're making sure that the product is resonating with the audience. I would have preferred something very different 2 years back versus now. So the product has to constantly evolve, and the teams behind the product need to understand that, what I've made today, maybe 2 years, it may not even be relevant. So I need to make sure that, I'm catching the vibe of my users and continuously, taking cues from how it is getting received by my users.
And I think when you're looking to launch a game, just figuring out who your players are or what genre your game is, or making sure it's a good experience is not enough. You can't assume that it's going to work. So that's why I think nowadays you have open beta, you have closed betas, you have many ways to test stuff with your players, and that is super critical, right? Like you can never assume you could have had 10 games that have all been successes, and the next one that you do, you will be learning something new. So.
I guess that's another modern trend, isn't it? The early access, the open betas, like the ability to soft launch stuff ahead of global launch. I'm going to rewind slightly for Joseph. We're talking about kind of modern trends and newer factors in a game's success. But what would you say are kind of evergreen? What has always been, integral to a game's success?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know if I can think of any like specific mechanic because there are so many different kinds of games, but I would probably underscore the point that you made is that I think the most important thing and the thing that I think has been evergreen in terms of the teams that are successful, in my opinion, has been more often than not this understanding of the player and like the teams that are the tastemakers, that understand their audience and have a clear understanding of what those players are looking for. And especially when we think about very impacted genres. And the funny thing about our space is that it seems that almost every genre is up for grabs. So there was a time when we all thought that match 3 there's no way you can be competitive in the match 3 space. That there's too many players, too many big players, and yet, Dream Games with Royal Match was able to go in, and today they dominate, right? They're one of the top 3 to 5, highest grossing games in the world. And they were able to achieve that success in an incredibly competitive market by understanding the very small nuances, by being extremely deep in their specific genre and knowing that little difference. And I think that for many of us that look at the match 3 space, I think we'd be hard pressed to say, what did they do different? What is it that makes Royal Match successful and some of these other games not as successful? And so having that depth and understanding what the player wants, I think is, again, not from a mechanics perspective, but more on the supply side in terms of the kinds of developers that find success, I think I would agree with your point.
Like with a game like Royal Match, there's also the numbers game of the user acquisition, like to be able to scale it to a certain point where it then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it keeps running. That is something that as game developers we don't think as much about, and that's technically a different skill altogether.
Right, and I think the other thing, one of the things that Mr. Beast, the famous YouTuber, said is that when he makes videos, if a video is 10% better than another video, that video actually doesn't do 10% better. It might do 20x better or 50x better because these videos all exist on a massive globally distributed platform where discovery is going to some of these top games or top videos. And so I think that's the other thing that we have to understand is that in the games that we work on, that very small difference could make a huge impact. And in fact, when you look at the history, like look at Game of War when it first launched in the app stores. So at that time, Kingdoms of Camelot was the #1 4X game in the space, and it had an LTV of probably between like $8 to $10. Now, when Machine Zone worked on Game of War, they went to China and they studied these Chinese games that had a few additional mechanics, like a VIP mechanic, a bank mechanic, these other mechanics. And all they did is they copied Kingdoms of Camelot, but they added these extra monetization mechanics that was able to push their LTV, not from $8 to $10, but from $10 to $12. And when we're looking at these kinds of, auction-based markets, that small difference doesn't make you, 20% better. It allows you to capture almost the entire space, right? And that's what MZ did. Is they're like, okay, our LTVs are higher. it's an auction-based market in terms of user acquisition. We're just gonna take the whole market.
We're talking about like some of the biggest companies, some of the dominating companies in mobile here. Obviously, like Dream Games are doing amazingly. EA, fairly hefty company. What kind of nuances and considerations do we need to think about when it's come to indies, like and smaller developers? Like how do they kind of compete in this space and take advantage of kind of modern trends to stand out?
Sorry, I don't want to talk too much. You guys want to? I've got some thoughts, but maybe you guys could start. Okay. So one of the really interesting things that I have seen is that when we look at, and again, I'm not like an expert on the PC console space, but when we look at the mobile market relative to the HD space, one of the things that we're seeing is that, in fact, this is a market that's increasingly favoring indies, right? And so when we look back over the last couple of years in terms of some of the hits that have launched and been top Steam games, whether it's Valheim, Lethal Company, BattleBit, there are all of these games by single or very, very tiny teams that have achieved #1 grossing on Steam. Now, it isn't so much the case in the mobile space because, and I mentioned earlier, you have these 3 pillars, right? And so you have to not only be great at the product, but you also have to be great at live ops. And certainly that's like the biggest weakness on the PC side. You see the spike, and then these companies like Palworld or whatever, they don't have live ops, and so then they crash. And then the growth part, right? And so if you're a small indie working on a 4X game, you're trying to compete against Century that has whiteout survival, and they have 200 people just doing creatives for ads, right? That's not the game development team. That's not, product managers. That's all part of the growth team just doing creatives, right? So I would say that for indies, I do think that one of the things that I've noticed over the past 5 years is that I fundamentally believe that the way in which we make games is broken. That we're seeing a lot of these massively funded $100, $200 million big budget games that are just not working out. And then we're seeing, at least on the PC side, these small teams that have great ideas and they're able to achieve success. Now, I think there are some structural factors that are potentially, preventing these smaller teams from being as successful on the mobile side. But I do think that it's probably going to get a little bit better, especially if things get cleaned up a little bit on the UA side and with AI. I'm hoping there's more space. But I would say on the PC side, it seems like it's a great day to be an indie.
I would say one very simple thing that indie game developers or anybody who's starting out, whom are you building for? You need to know that what is the audience, what is the size, what is the end goal. The moment you have clarity on that end goal, you will figure out a path. But if you're making something because it sounds very cool to you, it sounds very cool to your friends, well, it's good. But if you're trying to build a business, have that complete clarity on whom am I ultimately building for.
Maybe I could, so I agree and disagree with you. So, but maybe I could add on to this. I think that what you say is true, and I think that is a path to success, but I also think that the other path is also a path to success. And if you guys haven't read this book, there's a book by a guy by the name of Rick Rubin called The Creative Act. And I would highly recommend you check out that book. But there is also a philosophy, and it depends, right? Not everybody is Steve Jobs. Not everybody is Rick Rubin. But there is also a philosophy that if you build something that you yourself believe is great, don't worry about the market. Don't worry about anybody else. You can be successful. And in my experience as an old guy working with many game studios in the past, I've actually seen both sides achieve success. So again, I'm not saying you're wrong. I kind of agree with you, but also I have seen these kind of like weird savant guys, oh, I got this idea, you know, and it's like, oh, there's this weird guy working on some kind of crazy idea that he hasn't checked the market, he hasn't checked anything, but, you know, sometimes I think this kind of approach can also be successful.
Yeah, that's true, but I would say like playing the percentages, like this approach is probably a higher percentage. That one is like it's like a horse versus a unicorn.
Maybe, but I think the other thing that we've seen is like right now, I would say that the industry isn't favoring the current model of green lights, of these like MBA guys who don't know games at all that are green lighting a lot of these games. And a lot of what we're seeing now, and when I talked about too many Me Too games, and a lot of these $100, $200 million budget games that are being you know, that are not being successful is because it's like, hey guys, we can't take risks. We have to make it, prove to me, show me the data that this game can be successful. And when you're that data oriented and being driven by the data and not willing to take risk, I think that's when you fall into this trap of like making the wrong product.
I think the question here was not about data, but the user. Like, whom are you building for? Whom do you expect will play the game?
No, I understand that. And all I'm saying is, again, I'm not disagreeing with you. And I just said earlier as well that you should understand the user. But I'm also saying there might be some developer here who has a crazy idea, who strongly believes in it. And all I have to say is I'm old enough now to be humble enough to say that sometimes if you don't check the data, if you don't check with players, but you yourself fundamentally believe that it's a great product, I've seen that succeed sometimes too. That's all I'm saying.
Funnily enough, I was speaking to an indie publisher earlier this year, and they were talking about how so many companies are now risk averse and avoiding risks, that actually that is, from their perspective, the riskier approach. Is actually like playing it safe isn't that safe anymore, because if everyone's doing that, everyone's making the same thing, and you need to kind of disrupt and do different things.
Right. And like when you look at, for example, Steve Jobs, he didn't do player validation or testing. Elon Musk does not do, you know, like validation. And so again, it's like, to some degree, it's like, who are you? Are you the tastemaker that can actually predict these things? Not everybody is like that, but again, I've seen cases where it works out.
I think the one cool thing about being an indie developer is you do not have the pressure of large production budgets. So you can release your game, and you can figure out at what point you want to, like if, you know, based on how it's doing, you can figure out at what point you want to learn from it and build your next game, right? Like that's, it's very difficult in large organizations because you've already spent a lot, and then so it's a constant tussle of, do we continue so that we can get it to the level we want, or do we just treat it as sunk costs? For an indie developer, you don't have that pressure. So.
No, I guess indie developers, like almost an advantage, I guess, is like all they need to do is their game needs to provide them with enough funding for the next game. Like, and that's a lower bar for success. Easier said than done. I fully recognize that. I'm not a developer. I have no idea what you guys go through. But yeah. Going back to you were talking about, like, it's hard to kind of predict what's going on. I'm going to make the three of you do that now. It is really hard to kind of predict what's going to become a big trend in the industry. How do you keep track? How do you stay flexible and adaptable and keep an eye on what's happening in the industry so that you can kind of see the signs before they emerge and see where the industry is going, what sort of things are going to start affecting whether or not games are successful?
I kind of do two things. And so one thing that I do is I do watch the markets carefully in terms of looking at data every week in terms of the top games and top mechanics, and just looking for trending games and what kinds of games are trending in the market, and just kind of checking those games out on a weekly basis. And the second thing that I do, and this is something I would recommend for many folks in the audience, is to get a tribe of fellow people in the industry. And so for me, I have 6 other game CEOs that I've kind of created a little bit of a tribe or a club with. And every month we have a talk about different aspects of the games industry, a different specific topic that we're struggling with. But also during those meetings, a lot of things will get surfaced in terms of trends or things that are happening in the industry. And we just touch base every month. And so those are the 2 things that I personally do.
So yeah, when you're learning, in games, because we've had so many great successes, learn from the best. So, you can always come across games trying to do different things, but if you are trying to understand that, what needs to be done, then referring to people who have done it and not just doing that, but understanding the thought process behind it. Sometimes, even when you see a simple icon, you'll be like, okay, fine, so what about it? But the kind of thought and the philosophy that has gone behind it, I think develop that knack that when you're looking at a product, when you're looking at a game, understand that why it is where it is. So that is one thing that, I always look out for, that if some game introduce something, what's the why behind it? And the second thing is maybe a little underrated, but we speak to a lot of our users. Now, our players are playing other games as well, and sometimes you actually understand that there is a blind spot which you may not be catering to. So I think these are two things which I personally keep an eye out for.
I don't know if it's an answer to your question per se, but I think it's relevant. So when Starbucks first became popular, they had this thing where you don't go in for the coffee, you go in for the experience. I think that the way games are evolving and the way the audience is evolving, a lot of the audience are in it for the experience. They may not be your traditional definition of a gamer. Like UGC is big now, and that's not playing games, it's creating content. A lot of players, well, a lot of people like to watch streaming of others playing games, right? So whatever you can do to create that, it's about getting eyeballs and getting attention and getting time of people in the experience that you're providing. And so I think that any trend, anything that's going to fit in that space could become a big trend.
The giant scary clock tells me we've got just over 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask one more question for now, and then I'm going to pass it to the audience. So audience, have a think about if you've got questions for the panel. My last question for now is kind of continuing this trend. Are there any things that you three predict are going to change or going to become more important or going to become less important when it comes to determining a game's success? Anything in your little tribe club that you think is on the horizon that's going to, like I say, either kind of, that is going to change the way that we should approach making and releasing games?
Yeah, well, I generally have 3 characteristics that I look for from a team, so more on the supply side rather than in terms of the product itself. But I have noticed that the teams that are the most successful or have the highest rate of successful outcomes, in my experience, have 3 characteristics. First, they are very deep in a specific genre and not scattered across multiple types of genres and trying a lot of things. And so they get very deep in one area. Secondly, it's a team that's worked together for at least 4 years. And again, I'm not saying these are the only factors that determine success, but I've just seen that these teams with these 3 characteristics have an much higher rate of success. And the third is our teams with, and again, this is not going to be popular with some folks here, is teams that do have a hardcore work ethic.
So you're mentioning what could be predictors or something that they should do which the game developers weren't doing earlier? Got it. One I would say is user acquisition. Again, a lot of the landscape has changed. 10 years back, you could publish a game and actually get lucky and get tons of downloads. But now the market has gotten very crowded. So it's important that initially, while you're building the product for fun and engagement and other aspects, do have that in mind that, at scale, how am I going to achieve scale for my game? And, being at least having that thought at a subconscious level, I would say please definitely do that. And second, I would say is agility. You may start with a concept, but it is going to evolve over time. And that's where the receptivity to what, the market is, what the players are saying, is going to be very important because people are having access to a lot of wonderful games. There is no dearth of games. And what is happening is, because of the overlap, people are playing different types of games. So an audience which was very core to you is playing other games as well. So you got to make sure that you're standing out. So for that, the bar will always be very high.
I'm going to say the cliche thing of Gen AI. I think that is something that in this market where it's, success is not guaranteed, the quicker you can get a game out, the more darts you're throwing, and eventually you'll get a success. And so I think one way to really speed development is the use of AI, and so I think that's going to become more and more prevalent as we go.
Yeah, for all the debates around Gen AI and the ethical ways of using it, whether or not people are going to abuse it, it's not going away. Is you kind of, I've been listening to this in different industries as well. They're saying like you either keep up, and that's not necessarily to say to use it, but just keep aware of it, or you get left behind. Like it's not going away. I have a question for the audience then. Does anyone have any questions for the panel? Anyone? There's one at the back. Watch as the man in the very, very bright t-shirt runs across the room.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. Wonderful listening to all of you. You mentioned, Keerti, about the UA piece. What portion of your overall strategy will you take it as your UA? How much will you put in your UA bucket of the overall? In terms of percentage.
Can you repeat the question as well?
He's asking that how significant is UA as a part of your strategy? So for any business to become massive, you need users, right? So user acquisition is as pivotal as it is to any other business. And the second, I would say, is the product, the fun aspect of the game itself. And the third is community, which gives you a moat. So in my view, these are like three pillars of making a massive business.
And if you have to apportion the amount from your overall business case, what will be the amount of apportionment?
Amount of?
Apportionment. So you're building your business case and you're raising funds. How will you put into your user acquisition?
I mean, that depends on the stage of the business, right? I would say at least 40% should be allocated to user acquisition.
Thank you so much.
Person slightly further back.
Hi, I'm Rajat. My question is towards both of you, Keerti and Abhimanyu. You both mentioned UA, importance of UA, and you mentioned about Gen AI. So, do you see play?
I'm so sorry, you're quite quiet. Can you try talking a bit louder?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. Since you mentioned UA and you mentioned Gen AI, do you see use of Gen AI in playable ads, or have you seen people using it?
100%.
Can you give me some examples?
So with, all the user acquisition tools, they're very sophisticated in, the tuning with which they can make you reach the right audience. But once you've reached the right audience, would he download the game or not? That, to a great extent, becomes the function of the creative that you're putting out there. Now, Gen AI can actually give you, the freedom to generate lots of creatives and then experiment, and then you will know which is the winner, rather than spending, couple of weeks trying to perfect just 2 or 3 creatives. So I think Gen AI and UA can be a phenomenal use case.
Okay, I have a follow-up question. This is the last one. Since you mentioned that it might help, do you see the portion of playable ads increasing in the future because of Gen AI?
So playable ads work very well in certain platforms. So when we talk about UA also, it's very important to understand that each platform has its own nuances. So for example, playable ad may not do very good on Instagram, but it'll do very good on AppLovin and Unity. So it is platform specific. And again, if you have a good understanding of your user base, you can know what kind of users am I attracting from which platform and then fine tune it.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much.
Still got 4 minutes, so any other, yes, already there, okay.
Yeah, hi. This is Abhishek, an indie developer. So there was a very interesting tweet by Sam Altman a few months ago. I don't know if you guys have read it, but would love your comments on the tweet. He said that movies are going to become video games, and video games are going to become something unimaginably better. So I think he is imagining things where, entertainment becomes highly interactive and games, transform into something else. So if you guys have any thoughts on this.
I think it's a wonderful quote because when we go to movies, it basically helps us shut off from the world what is happening. Somebody's in the hospital, some financial crisis is happening. So you can just zone off, and those 3 hours provide just an immersion and actually make you feel good when you walk out. This is what games do, but they do it at a level where you can have this immersion anytime, anywhere, whenever you want. So I get that, games are going to be super powerful because they're going to help you have your zone out sessions and, continue to have an identity in a game, which you may not be able to have in the real world for XYZ reasons.
I mean, I think there's always been this promise of having a greater experience with VR and things like that. I'm sure at some point it'll be there, but I also wouldn't discount existing sort of use cases, modalities of playing games. Like, if you're in line at Starbucks, there's a reason why people like playing some of these fast, casual games on a convenient device. So I don't think these other forms of gameplay go away, but I'm certainly excited about new ways of having games be developed and having different kinds of experiences. I just think it's a little further off.
I think gamification is also something that's interesting. Like, it has always been there in certain fields, but you're starting to see more of gamification in health. Like, there's folks working on administering of tablets and so on and gamifying that experience. In the edtech space, gamification has always been there, but that can scale much more as we go forward. So that could be another way to interpret what he said, where the games can be everywhere and do everything for you.
I'm so glad none of you said metaverse. Any other questions? Any other questions?
Thanks a lot, guys.
Not seeing it. Yep, one in the middle here. He's walking to, no, okay, we'll come back.
Hi, I'm a 16-year-old game developer working for Insanity Crew Games. My question is that at the start you said that we have to look at the users to know what is the trend and then work according to it. Whereas the counter was that if you are able to see the vision from your perspective that it's going to be a great game, you have to go for it. So it's like if we see the games that are available which were not trending, but the game made, people who made the game saw it trend. So my question is, they are not surviving in long term, such as Among Us and other games. So my question is, what's your opinion on it? That when we don't go with the trend, they're not surviving in the long run.
Did you understand that? Is your question, sometimes you see trends in the gaming industry, but you have personal conviction of doing something else. So do you follow the trend, or do you do what you have personal conviction about? Was that the question?
How do you repeat those successes is his thing, I think. He's saying,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. So I think that's the kind of like, that's a big question. I think there's going to be a lot of people who believe they're right and fail, and then there's going to be a few people who believe they're right against trend and are very successful. So, the big question is, who are you? I think, like, ultimately, I always think that people should follow the vision that they believe in, but then, again, it's one of those things. Maybe you go down the Rick Rubin path and just do what you believe in, but I would kind of try to do a blend of both. Is that you might have personal conviction against something, but test it out, see what players think, and then if you consistently, then it's going to be a battle between your personal conviction and what you're seeing from players and hearing in terms of external feedback.
Yeah, are there any examples of games which are worked in long run, which were made by personal convention?
Yeah, I mean, I think Brawl Stars is an example of that, right? So the Brawl Stars team, I don't know if you guys know the story about this, but many folks told that team to shut down. And many folks said at that time, like creating that kind of like, sort of battle royale type of, isometric battle royale, nobody really thought that they would be very successful. And there were a lot of people who were claiming you can't be successful with that model. The only people who believed in that game was a game team. And then I think, famous story is Ilka just said, okay, you guys still believe in it, keep going. And ultimately, Brawl Stars is now one of the top, it's a top 15, 20 grossing game globally. And, as I mentioned before, has reached all-time highs last year. So I think you're always going to find counterexamples. I think that the most important thing is to understand your specific situational context. You're always going to be able to find examples of, where, oh, I believed in my vision and it was right. And on the flip side too. And so sometimes what we do as human beings is we'll take an outcome and we'll look back and that's a lesson based on the outcome, right? But ultimately, there's a little bit of, randomness in life, and I think that if you truly believe in something and you've gotten some feedback and you still believe in it despite negative feedback, I personally would say just keep going. But I don't know what other folks here think.
Okay, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for because the angry time's up screen is blaring at me. So thank you so much for joining us, and please give a round of applause to my panel.
Thank you.